everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. I'm Tammy Diedrich, the Managing Editor of IBM Systems Magazine Power Systems Edition, and I'm the moderator for this event. Today's webinar is sponsored by Botz & Associates and is titled, How to Achieve SSO in a Day. Our featured speaker today is Patrick Botz. Patrick is the President and CTO of Botz & Associates and is an internationally known security expert, specializing in information security as a business tool first and as technology second. His passion for SSO began when he joined IBM in 1989, where he held several positions, including lead security architect and the founder of IBM Lab Services security consulting team. He architected the SSO solution for OS 400 and i5OS, and he holds several security-oriented patents. Today, Patrick will explain how to cut through the technological complexity of single sign-on so that you can eliminate password hassles for your users and cut costs associated with managing passwords. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A period, so please feel free to enter your questions in the question panel on your screen anytime during the presentation. Now, without further ado, thanks again for joining us today. And Patrick, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
All right, thanks, Tammy. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, whatever the case may be. Thank you for attending. Today, we're going to talk about something that's been near and dear to my heart for well over 10 years. And it's really something that I think everybody can benefit from. It can be a big win for not only you or the IT organization, but your entire organization. So over the last several years, we've been inundated by heavy expense cutting. And that's not just in the IT organization, but that's throughout all of our businesses. There's been a high focus on keeping costs down and not adding new costs. And there's also been staffing pressure. There's been pressure on us to do more with less. People are not replaced when they leave. And oftentimes, many of us have been through downsizing. And so we are expected to do more with even fewer people. This creates a lot of stress. And it also creates a lot of advantages. What I want to talk about today is to show you a way that you can be the hero, not only for your IT department, but really for your entire organization. And wouldn't it be nice in your job if you could have your picture right here? So it turns out there is a relatively easy way to impress your management and delight your customers and to put a smile on their faces. And that's associated with password management. Several years ago when I was at IBM and I was actually implementing the technologies associated with single sign-on for OS 400, I actually led that project for all of IBM, not just OS 400, but that's where I was working. I started thinking about just how much time does it take me at IBM to change the passwords that I'm forced to change every 3 months, 4 times a year. And I thought, it probably takes me 5 or 10 minutes to do that. And so I kept track of it for a year. And what I found was my average time was between 30 and 45 minutes. I was actually quite surprised that it took that much time. And then I started thinking about, well, I wonder how much time that costs IBM across the entire organization, assuming I was an average example. And how much money did that translate into? And so I started doing some calculations. And I started out with just a rough calculation that took the number of employees times the number of hours that were spent on password changes times an average dollar per hour salary and times the number of changes per year. And what I found was those numbers really, really rack up quick, turned into a lot of dollars very quickly. If you take 30 minutes per password change and multiply that times 4 times a year, and then if you take what actually is a fairly low estimate of the average hourly salary across the organization, I use 20, for 300,000 employees, that was $12 million a year. For 200,000, it was $8 million a year. Now, more reasonable numbers that probably match closer to what many of the people on the line have is maybe 3,000 employees. Even at 3,000 employees, that's $120,000 a year that your company is paying its employees to change its passwords. That really seems like an inefficient situation. And even at 500 employees, that's $20,000 a year that the company is spending just so employees can change their passwords. You know, you could maybe hire a consultant for that, or hire a part-time person or a technician or something, even at the $20K per year. So the important thing to understand about this calculation is this doesn't include any of the costs that are associated when somebody actually tries to log in after they've changed all their passwords, and they can't get in, so they have to call the help desk and get help resetting their password or whatever happens when they can't log in. So, and that's another big part of the cost. So why was it taking me a half hour to change 7 passwords? Well, part of the problem is that they were 7 passwords on 7 different platforms and a couple of different applications, and they all had different password composition rules. And I could never remember from one change to the next which one was the strictest one. If I changed the strictest one first and got a password that would meet those requirements, then typically that password would work on the rest of them, and I'd be able to remember what that password was until next time. If I started with a different system, well, then I'd change 2 or 3 of them. I'd get to the most restrictive one, and then the password that I chose wouldn't work. So then I had to decide, well, do I keep a different password on this one system and hope that the other password will work on the rest of them, or do I go back and change all the previous ones to one that will work on all the machines? And all of that ends up taking a lot of time. And then partway through my time at IBM, they started implementing restrictions on how soon you could change your password again after you had just changed it. And so I would actually have to sometimes go to a help desk to get help to set my passwords up the way they were. So you can see how that time, that just in changing your password can add up real quickly. And again, that doesn't include the time that it takes an employee once they think they have their password set up, and then they try to get into a system and they can't. It doesn't include the employee's time for that stuff, and it doesn't include the help desk time. Now, after thinking about this for a long time and wanting to get to a better estimate of just how much it costs people to change passwords, I put together a little spreadsheet. And you can get that spreadsheet free from my website at the URL that's listed there. And it has 4 sheets to it, and there are 2 sheets that you enter information on, and then 2 of those sheets show the results of calculations based on those numbers. The first sheet is where you put information in about the number of people, the average number of passwords, the average amount of time you think it takes somebody to change their password, and also it has a way that you can put track help desk time on password-related issues. So it's a lot more accurate estimate of your cost, and of course it ends up being a lot higher than the method I've used on the previous page. But you can download the ROI calculator for free. You can mess with just the password management cost portions of it. The other portion, the other part of this calculator allows you to enter in estimates for any kind of solution that you're thinking about or that you've put in place to solve the problem. And that allows you to estimate the cost to acquire a solution, if it's a product, the cost to implement it, and the cost to manage it over time. And then with both the password management costs and the cost of the solution, the tool will actually show you an ROI and help you determine how long it is before you recoup your investment in whatever solution you're looking at. And of course, if you're looking at multiple solutions, you just go through that the calculator twice, and then you can compare the ROI between the 2 different solutions. If you download it and you can't figure out how it works and you want help, just contact me through the website, and we can set up a half hour to help you go through it and make your estimates. I don't think enough people take advantage of this. I think it's important to understand what your current costs are, because in the end, SSO is a business solution to a business problem. It's not a technical solution to a technical problem. So how does single sign-on help you reduce password costs? Now, a lot of people think of single sign-on and they think of it only in terms of the time at which a user is presented a logon screen and has to enter a user ID and password. But the majority of the time with password management is set in managing those users, those passwords, excuse me. And single sign-on is also a very ambiguous term. When I talk about single sign-on, what I'm really talking about is integrating your authentication across your entire network, not just your Windows platform, with Active Directory. And I use the term Active Directory loosely here because the authentication protocol that Microsoft uses when you log into a Windows domain is called Kerberos. And Active Directory is really just a repository of information, of authentication information, plus some other related information. I also, when I say SSO, I am also assuming that you will not have to rename user IDs on any of your platforms. You won't have to change any existing access control schemes, and that's primarily because if you don't have to change your, rename your user IDs, then your access control schemes are still valid. And the most important benefit and concept when I say SSO is the fact that you can actually eliminate passwords outside of Active Directory. That means on an IBMI, you can set a password to star none. On AIX, Unix, Linux, you can use a no password property, and yet people are still authenticated when they access the system. It's just that they're not using their user ID and on that system to do the authentication, they're in effect, but not actually using their Windows ID and password. We'll talk a little bit more about Kerberos in a minute to help you understand why that works and why that is still secure. So what technologies do you need to have to use to implement SSO, according to my view of it, my vision of it, if you will, and how do you enable those technologies in your systems? Now, I'm going to, for a lot of this, I'm going to use IBM I as an example, and that's primarily because the IBM I has put together some wizards and stuff to make a lot of this really easy to configure. But all of these technologies can be enabled across Unix, Linux, and even Macs and mobile devices. So to enable non-Windows platforms, I'm sorry, to enable SSO, you need to enable Kerberos on non-Windows platforms or systems and applications and environments. So when I say platform, I'm really talking about logging into a system. An application would be something like a third-party application that has its own user ID and password that you have to use to access it. It's not the same user ID and password that you access the system with. And when I use the term environments, what I'm talking about is like web application servers, web servers, and mobile devices, those sorts of things. So if you want to enable SSO, what you do is you enable your non-Windows platforms to participate in that Kerberos authentication protocol, in effect in the Windows domain. You also have to have a network-wide authentication integration with Active Directory, meaning that each platform is able to translate between a Windows ID, i.e. an ID defined in Active Directory, and the local ID that represents the same person on that system application or in that environment. And then you need to eliminate your non-Windows passwords. Now, you don't have to get rid of your non-Windows passwords, your IBM I password, your Unix password. You don't have to get rid of those, but you want to get rid of those for most of your users, because when you keep those passwords around, they still have to be managed at some point. They have to be changed every 90 days or whatever your requirements are. They should be changed every 90 days. And when you're using SSO, if you're never using those passwords, people sometimes forget what those passwords are. And when they have to change it because of audits or whatever, then they still have problems changing it, and now they're taking help desk time. So while eliminating your non-Windows passwords for most of your users isn't required, it's still strongly recommended to get your best and quickest return on investment. So how do you do all this? Well, first of all, the first thing you do is, in the IBM world, Kerberos, the Kerberos protocol is known as the Network Authentication Service. Now, Kerberos was invented by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the early 80s. It's named based on Kerberos, which is spelled C-E-R-B-E-R-U-S, which is from Greek mythology, for the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades. Now, the 3 here is important because Kerberos is a third-party authentication protocol. And what that means is if A is trying to authenticate to B, and A trusts C and B trusts C, then B can trust C to vouch for A. In other words, if you have a consultant from IBM come in, and they come in and they prove to you that they are an IBM consultant because they have something that you're sure makes them an IBM consultant, and you call up that person's manager and says, hey, did you send Pat Botz or whomever here to consult with us? And the manager says, yes, we did. Well, you're relying really on a third party to vouch for the fact that the person in front of you is from IBM and they are who they say they are. And that's essentially how Kerberos works. In Windows, using Windows definition language, the Windows domain controller is your trusted third party. And when somebody is running on a Windows platform and tries to access your I or Unix or Linux machine, a piece of information called a ticket. It's not a user ID and password. It's a ticket. It does contain the Windows user ID. Is passed to the non-Windows machine, and the non-Windows machine verifies that that's a valid ticket. And if it's a valid ticket, the non-Windows machine knows that the Windows domain controller trusts that person who gave it to you to be who they say they are. And then if you take the Windows user ID out of that ticket, you now know what user ID that person is claiming to be, and you also know that they are trusted to be who they claim to be. That, in a nutshell, and at a super high level, is what Kerberos authentication is. Probably the important thing to remember about that is that in the Kerberos authentication protocol, passwords never flow off the system. Even when you log into the workstation for the first time and enter your password, that password is not passed to the domain controller. It's actually used to decrypt some information that the domain controller sends back. And if you're able to successfully decrypt that and prove that you could to the domain controller knows that you must have the password without you actually giving it to the domain controller. And then from then on, these tickets are used, and there's encryption involved, and the encryption is used to verify that other parties were trusted and all that kind of stuff. So once you enable a non-Windows platform to participate in the Kerberos environment, that means you've got the authentication portion completed. But if you're in AIX or on the IBM I, knowing somebody's Windows user ID doesn't necessarily tell you what user ID they use in your environment, in your local environment. So that's what this EIM thing is for. EIM is Enterprise Identity Mapping, and it's really just a cross-reference. It's a user ID cross-reference. It keeps track of which user IDs are related to the same entities. So, Pat Botz might be an entity in EIM, and I might be P Botz in Windows, and I might be Botz PS in an IBM I, and I might just be Botz in Unix. And EIM is used to keep track of the fact that all three of those represent me, and then given any one of those, I can find any other user ID that represents me. So EIM is a user ID cross-reference, and it's what's used so that you don't have to rename user IDs, across all the platforms so that you don't then also have to redo all of your access control schemes. Once you create an EIM repository, then you have to add that cross-reference information for each entity into the repository. So network authentication service is what IBM calls Kerberos. And Kerberos is the authentication protocol that you're using when you log into a Windows domain. Now, there's some legal reasons why IBM didn't just call its implementation of Kerberos, but suffice it to say, to meet the license requirements of the MIT open source code, IBM was unable to sell a product that implemented Kerberos and call it Kerberos. And on some platforms, when this was all implemented, you had to buy the network authentication service function as a separate product or feature. To configure NAS on an IBM I, you can use iSeries Navigator. And in the iSeries Navigator, there's network authentication service, and you right-click on that, and that brings up a wizard, and you answer 5 or 6 questions, and you click OK, and your IBM I is configured. Now, you can do all of that configuration by hand, manually, on the IBM I, and most seasoned Unix administrators probably do that configuration by hand. But for people who don't understand the protocol and don't want to learn how the configuration file has to look and learn about things called key tables and all that kind of stuff, the wizard hides virtually all of that from you. So that's under the security tab underneath the system that you are configuring to participate in the Windows domain authentication. Once you have NAS or Kerberos configured, and you've tested that configuration to make sure that all the pieces are talking to each other across the network, then you can go in and configure enterprise identity mapping. And enterprise identity mapping also has a wizard, also has 6, 7 questions that you need to answer. And that can be found under the Network tab in iSeries Navigator. This can also be configured by hand, but you have to know more than you want to about LDAP and some other things, and it's much easier and faster to use a configuration wizard. Now, an EIM repository in the documentation and everything is referred to as an EIM domain. And of course, people get that confused with a Windows domain. A Windows domain is, the user IDs in a Windows domain is some of the information that is managed in EIM, but the Windows domain and an EIM domain are not synonymous. Okay, so an EIM domain has associations for user IDs in non-Windows systems also, and the Windows domain doesn't. So the EIM domain is a bigger entity. They're not the same thing. They just happen to use the same terminology. Whoever decided to use that terminology should probably be shot. And by the way, that was me that made that decision. So I guess I'd have to shoot myself. So once you have EIM set up and you've configured a non-Windows platform to, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing back on EIM. EIM is a network resource. You only need one repository for all of your non-Windows systems to use. Now, it's got to be stored somewhere, so you can pick a machine to store it on. But once you've created an EIM repository, the rest of the machines just, quote unquote, join that EIM domain. And they can use it just the same way as the machine on which it happens to be hosted uses it. But that's very important to understand that you don't want to have multiple copies of EIM that you're managing separately. So once you have those things set up, then you have to tell the Windows domain about the non-Windows system that you're going to have participate in that Windows domain. And basically, it's a join domain, but because it's not a Windows workstation that's joining the domain, it's done a little bit differently. Now, when you use the NAS or Kerberos configuration wizard out of iNavigator, it produces a Windows batch file that you can run on the Windows domain controller that defines your non-Windows platform and services to the Windows domain. And that definitely is the easiest way of doing it. Again, you can also, if you know what you're doing, you can do all of that by hand. Typically, what I do for customers that have Unix and IBM I is I will take the batch file configured from the wizard and then just change it for the information that's needed for the AIX machine. And it's just faster than doing that than trying to come up with the commands and all of the parameters from scratch. So once you've defined your non-Windows system to the Windows domain, you still have to tell the applications that you're going to be using to access your non-Windows platforms that they can use the Kerberos protocol. And depending on the application, that's done differently. It's not a system-wide switch or anything. And people can still, administrators, for example, may still want to access a system not using Kerberos. So it's very flexible. It's definitely not a big switch that you have to turn on for everybody, and it has to work for everybody all at the same time. You can configure people and applications on a very individual one-by-one basis. So when we originally set up created the EIM repository, we added information for a test user to it, and we set up the associations, the user ID association. So now you can test that user. And assuming everything works, then the next step is to add identity mapping information for all of your end users. Now, lots of people do that by hand, and it's very cumbersome. When I help customers set it up, I have a utility that we use that automates that whole process. Then part 3, the best part is you just get rid of the passwords from your non-Windows systems. And on IBM I, you set the password to *none. Depending on your Unix and Linux flavor, there's either a no password property. You can go in and edit the etc password file directly, but several different ways of doing it. And some applications will also let you remove the passwords. Some applications won't. Third-party applications are the ones that are the most cumbersome to deal with, and there are third-party applications that you aren't able to get them to participate in Kerberos because they weren't designed for it, and the vendors only support their way of doing authentication, which typically is storing a user ID and password in a database file. But to configure the Telnet emulator for the IBM I, for example, if you go into the connection properties, there's an option there that says use Kerberos. You can also set it for INAV or even client access to use Kerberos, and then you can use the use client access settings or use INAV settings for the application. So number of ways, but you have to tell the application that it should use the Kerberos protocol and not a user ID and password protocol, because the application on the client side, for one, needs to know that it doesn't need to put up a prompt for a user ID and password. So I've been working with these technologies for, well, almost 30 years. Not the enterprise identity mapping, but certainly the Kerberos technologies for almost 30 years. And I happen to find these things second nature. I understand how they work. I understand how they work across multiple platforms. But it does tend to be daunting for system administrators who already have too much to do to think about, gee, I've got new technologies. It may not be a new technology, but it's new to them. I've got different platforms, and I'm only responsible for my Unix platforms or my IBM I or my Windows. And, you know, how do I get everybody on the same page, and how do I get them to know what they need to do, that sort of thing. And then there's just the concept of distributed algorithms, like third-party authentication and how those things work and why they work and all of that stuff. So SSO can seem quite complicated, and yet it doesn't take that long to set up as long as you understand how it all fits together. In addition to those complexities, you just have your environment complexities. You have multiple platform types. You have applications on top of those platforms, web application servers, web apps, mobile, et cetera. Then you got to think about high availability and how you manage that. And then, you know, things change. So your IBM I, you upgrade that to a new release. What if something breaks? You know, how do you fix it? Or you upgrade your Windows domain controller. How do you fix it? So this stuff can be complicated. The amount of work that's necessary is really relatively small, but the learning curve really seems to be very daunting to IT shops who, again, they already got more than they can do on their plate. And having to think about learning something entirely new is often very disconcerting. So even though the technologies involved here aren't new, what is new is a new managed SSO service. Now, we call our service SSO Stat. And the most important part of it is that we do the implementation for you, but with you. So we can do the implementation over WebEx, go to meeting, join me, and in fact, we don't even click the buttons. We walk you through it and we explain what's happening, why things are working the way they do, So we train your in-house admins. And then, just as importantly, we provide ongoing support for any authentication-related questions or issues. Now, that may be associated with Kerberos and something not working, or if I make this change, will there be any problems? But it may be something totally unrelated to Kerberos, but still authentication-related. We provide the support for any of those questions. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove the fear factor from administrators who want to implement SSO, want to get rid of passwords, but are just concerned about their ability to support it once it's implemented. Now, to give an example of what I would call a relatively small implementation is a company might have two instances of, say, an IBM or of Unix or something, but two of the same. Somewhere up to 500 users. And for those customers, we're still achieving over 100% return on investment in the first year, meaning given what it's costing them to manage passwords, after the first year, they've actually saved that much money, plus the cost of the managed service. And we can do, a quick quote, for your environment, a couple of questions, depending on the complexity, we can turn around request right away. And the most important thing is that in a typical environment, the implementation time takes less than a day. And sometimes we'll spend 30 minutes and we'll find out that something has to be changed in the DNS server, so we'll wait until the next day or a couple of days later when that change can be made, and then we'll spend another 20 minutes or whatever. But the amount of actual time that's taken to get this set up using some of our tools and all of that is typically well less than a day. So again, the purpose of managed SSO is to take away the fear factor from people being able to implement and manage this very cost-effective, affordable way to not only save the organization money, but to actually make the users in IT and throughout the whole environment, give them a little bit of relief from all the stress that they have from dealing with budget cuts and staffing issues and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't, because it's a managed service, there's no software that you have to purchase. And we teach you what you're doing as we make the changes. And over time, as people become more comfortable with that, they may choose to discontinue support. And that's fine with us because my goal is to get people using single sign-on and to get away from this password management nightmare that we've been in. And we think SSO Stat provides that peace of mind for those people who don't want to tackle it on their own. So you actually have a choice. You have all of the software you need. You have all the technology you need. You can implement SSO for yourself, or you can get a managed service and get expert help. You'll probably get it implemented faster. What it does is it buys you time for your learning curve. And either way, once you do implement this, your users are going to feel like this. Your management is going to feel like this. And you will be this. You'll be an IT hero. And your picture will be right here. So a quick summary to reduce costs and delight your users. Implementing SSO is one of the easiest and fastest ways that you can achieve those two things. With SSO Stat, you buy yourself time, you buy yourself education, and you buy yourself peace of mind because you can get it implemented fast. You get the training you need, and you have the ongoing support for as long as you want it. You can get the free SSO ROI calculator from our website. And again, that's something I don't think enough people take advantage of. It is not a marketing tool. It is truly something to help you figure out how much you're spending on password management. And if you have any question about your environment, about how something works or whatever, just send an email, fill out the contact us form on the website, or call us, and we'll be happy to talk to you. So with that, I think I'm done here, and I'll throw it back to Tammy.
All right, great. Thanks, Patrick. So we'll take a few minutes to answer some questions now. Again, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen to send it in. And we do have a lot of questions today, so if we don't get to your question for some reason, we will get back to you via email. Okay, first question. Isn't single sign-on less secure than having different passwords for different applications?
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and the answer is no. And the answer is it's not less secure. In fact, I would argue that it's a lot more secure. But from a logic point of view, all I really have to prove is that it's no less secure. And because it costs less to manage, it's a better solution. So why is it not any less secure? Well, when you manage passwords, that means you're typing them in and they have to flow over the network. It means that you've got user IDs and passwords stored in multiple places, which means you have to make sure you protect all of them as well as can possibly be done. And it means that when you type your passwords at your keyboard, any keyboard, I can't think of the name, keystroke grabber can capture those passwords. And in fact, by typing them in, the mere act of that makes them less secure. With Kerberos, you type your Windows password once, but it never leaves the system. And after that, passwords don't flow. They're these cryptographically secured, time-limited tickets that prove that you've been trusted by the Windows domain controller, and they are designed such that they can't be easily replayed, and even if they could be, it would have to be in a very short window of time. Kerberos is generally accepted by the security world as being a much better protocol than passwords, much stronger protocol than passwords. So the bottom line is that while I think it's more secure, I think it's easy to show that they're not any less secure, or Kerberos isn't any less secure. So because it costs us, that alone makes it better.
Okay. So here's an HA question. So in the past, I've successfully configured EIM and SSO for i5OS. However, I hit a snag in HA scenario. We do have an active HA in place where we switch the HA box every weekend. Do you have any information on how to replicate SSO setup in an HA environment?
Yes. In fact, I've done that for a number of customers. We have something we call an expansion pack that goes with our SSO stat that helps you set up SSO it helps you set up HA for EIM and Kerberos. And they're, depending on how you're managing your high availability currently, there are different ways of doing it that will be more efficient.
All right. A couple questions about web applications and whether it works with web applications.
Yeah, it works with most web applications as long as you're using an Apache web server or a Windows web server, which covers the vast majority of web servers. And it may even work with other web servers. I just haven't had to run into any that I had to figure out if it does. But essentially, it's a configuration option on a per URL basis, which tells it whether or not it should use Kerberos to authenticate for access to that URL.
Okay, another question. We have WebSphere running on iSeries. Can SSO be achieved between Java web applications running on System I and DB2 400? Our store procedures are secured by user or group.
The short answer is yes. Depending on the exact setup, it'll be done one way, or it may have to be done another. And there's sort of two different authentications that you need to think about. The first one is authenticating to WebSphere or the application running in WebSphere. And then there's the authentication between the WebSphere application and the DB2 database. And you have plenty of options there that you can use SSO, and one of them is carrying through the same person all the way through. The other one is having, as many people set up, although I don't like, is having some default connection between the WAS app and the DB2 backend. But the bottom line is, yes, that can.
Okay, so I'm going to try and sneak one more question in here real quick, but I know looking at the clock we don't have very much time. So another question about, I have 2 iSeries and 1 HA backup. Is role swap possible, or do I need to have an EIM duplicated on both iSeries?
Yeah, so that question is of the form, should I walk to work or carry my lunch? So it's kind of hard to answer, but you can set it up so role swap works. And then there are a number of ways of replicating the EIM repository without having to manage each repository separately. And which is the best way for you, again, depends on your specific organization. But as long as the replication is done such that they are essentially the same repository, meaning if you update one, the other one gets updated, and vice versa, then you can do a role swap.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to wrap this up because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But if we didn't get to your question, we will get back to you via email. Thanks so much for sending in so many great questions. And thank you, Patrick, for sharing your expertise with us today. Just a quick note that we will be sending out an email early next week with a link to a recording of today's presentation, as well as the charts and a link to the ROI calculator. And we will send that out to everyone who's on the call, as well as to anyone who registered for the event but for whatever reason couldn't make it. So that concludes our webinar. Thanks so much for attending, everyone, and have a great day.